Welcome everyone again. Thanks for coming. Our speaker today is David Hershenov. He's a professor at the University at Buffalo and the co-director of the Romanov Center for Clinical Ethics and the Philosophy of Medicine. He's interested in the metaphysics of personal identity, bioethics, and the philosophy of medicine. Today he's going to talk about health, harm, and potential. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, my co-director just resigned, so I can call myself the director now until they reappoint a new co-director. So I'm temporarily the director. I'll put that on my CV. Anyway, thank you for the invitation. If you read the paper, let me just say I'm going to skip some things because this is a metaphysics of teleology group. So I will stress my view of healthy development as the key to moral status in the minded, or mindless and minimally minded. And I'll probably skip over the PowerPoints having to do with some of the debates about time relative interest account that had to do with Ben Bradley, Bernard Williams, Peter Unger. But I have PowerPoints, and of course in the Q&A if anyone wants to talk about that. And I also added an appendix that wasn't in the paper about my theory of generic health, that I have this view that a notion of health that uses the species as the reference class can't fully accommodate do what we want, our ascriptions of health and disease. So maybe that will come up in the Q&A. All right, so health, harm, and potential, the interests of the mindless and minimally minded. So let me just give you a picture of where I'm going to go. Jeff McMahon, he claims that the counterfactual comparative account of harm can't explain our judgments about the harm done to individuals deprived of a future that they would either be not psychologically connected to or share only minimal mental ties. So as you probably know, the counterfactual comparative account of harm says compare the world in which a certain event occurs with a world in which a nearby world in which it didn't occur. And if the well-being is lower in the world where that event occurred, it would be a harm. And if the well-being where that event occurred is higher than the nearby world where it didn't occur, it would be a benefit. Okay. And so on McMahon's view, on the view of the counterfactual comparative account of harm, it would look like the earliest death would be the worst death because you would lose out on the greatest future, all else being equal. Two, McMahon maintains that since the mental life of a very young child or fetus will be extremely disconnected and different from that of his adult self, death is then, and it's important that we emphasize the time, is not as harmful to the youngster as it would be to a teen or a young adult, middle-aged adult, and so forth. Three, the harm of an event will be due, this is McMahon's view, not just to the future well-being it denies individuals, but how psychologically connected those individuals were at the time in question to the future. And he calls this account the time relative interest account of harm. And I'm going to go through its problems and offer an alternative. But let me just give you a little more of the roadmap. On this view, abortion and infanticide wouldn't seem to be much of a harm because the infant that is killed, just like the late fetus that is aborted, was just minimally conscious. And there's not going to be any harm in rendering embryos mindless and using them and their adult bodies as lab rats, organ banks, etc. So the idea is if you can't harm the mindless, you could just keep them mindless and grow them into adults and use them as you see fit. I'll offer here in 5 modification of McMahon's time relative interest. I'll call it the healthy development account that avoids such problems as it recognizes that mindless infants have an interest in developing a healthy mind, while I think my alternative will retain attractive features of McMahon's time relative interest account. The harm of death will still be a bell curve, but it won't be as low as minimal harm as McMahon claims. So 5A, the frustration of the interest in healthy development of the mindless and minimally human being will be a great harm on my modified account, much greater than the frustration of an interest in the healthy development of mentally comparable non-humans. Okay. 5B, the recognition of this will allow for a moderate speciesism, which is, as you probably know, is not in vogue. And I claim it will avoid all the reductios of potentiality, as humans are the only entities that are unhealthy when they don't develop into persons. So the idea will be the morally relevant potential will be healthy development, not some other sense of possibility, metaphysical possibility, logical, physical possibility, and so forth. All right, so that's the introduction. Let's look a little closer at McMahon's defense of the time relative interest account. This is first in his book, Ethics of Killing, but he's developed it, and there's a lot of literature about it. 6, McMahon contrasts his own time relative interest account with what he calls the life comparative account of the badness of death. And he claims Don Marquis, who's a famous pro-lifer, assumes that. And on that life comparative account, the worst death would be one that was suffered by the young fetus, the youngest fetus. So the younger you are, all else being equal, the more future you'll lose out on, the greater the harm. And if you think wrongness tracks harm, then the greatest will be the wrong of the earlier death. All right. 7, McMahon observes that people don't typically consider it as tragic and harmful when a few weeks old embryo miscarries than when, say, a newborn dies, which they won't find as harmful and tragic as the death of a young adult. And this isn't because we just put more effort into a fetus as it develops. Even if it's not your child and you're not emotionally involved and invested, you probably see it as less tragic. Okay. McMahon here in 8 concludes the degree of harm of a death depends not just upon the extent of the future deprivation, but upon the degree to which the deceased would have been psychologically tied to the future. So unlike the life comparative account, to find out how bad death is, we don't just look at what you're deprived of, but how connected you were at the time of your death to that future you lose out on. And so he thinks this makes sense of our attitudes to miscarriages, early abortions, stillborn, not being as bad a death as the death, say, of you or me. Because we're more tied to that future. We have projects, goals, interests, values that are frustrated, interrupted. We, in a sense, have taken ownership of that future as we are tied to it. McMahon, like Parfit, thinks an early death is almost like a loss. It's almost like the death of somebody else. You lose out on a future that isn't yours. It's as if someone else had died. And he tries to give some more support, not just in our attitudes to the deaths of the very young, but he makes up an interesting thought experiment called the cure. And so here in 9, you imagine you're 20 years old and you'll die painlessly in 5 years, unless you take a medicine that will cause total amnesia, radical change in personality and values, but will add 60 happy years of life. And these 60 years are going to be objectively good on any account of value. And McMahon thinks that you, like most people, will refuse the cure and rather just have 5 more years and then your painless death, where you have your biography intact, you haven't changed your personality, you recognize your loved ones, you can continue your project, write your book, do things with friends, and so forth. So you're passing on greater well-being. You're, in some sense, being imprudent, choosing the life with less overall well-being. And the explanation McMahon offers is that you're not connected to that future. I, in the paper, gave an example where you had, we contrast where you have, say, liver cancer, terminal liver cancer, you'd be excited to get a liver transplant. If you had terminal cerebrum cancer and somebody's body was mangled, but their cerebrum was fine and it could be transplanted in a sci-fi scenario, you may not be excited about having that transplant. If the insurance company doesn't pay for it, you may feel you're not harmed. Why? because you're not going to be psychologically connected to that mind of the new cerebrum. So even if we assume a theory of identity where you can survive with a new cerebrum, it won't be attractive to you. It won't be a harm to be denied it. It won't be a benefit to be given it. And you might think if it's no benefit to get a cerebrum transplant, no harm to be denied it, then it's no benefit for an embryo to grow a brain and a mind, and no harm for it to be aborted and never grow a brain and a mind. All right. So hopefully some of those examples, either mine or McMahon's, will resonate and make you somewhat sympathetic to a time relative interest account. I'll skip over some objections. Bradley is a critic of McMahon, and my responses to Bradley, and also there's a critique of the time relative interest account that comes from these future pain prudential concern thought experiments that Bernard Williams made famous, and Peter Unger, my old professor, developed. Skip those over. If you want to come back to them in the Q&A, fine, but I just thought, given the interest of the group, I should talk more about health. But let me say a little bit more about the cost of the time relative interest account, or the unmodified. I'm going to modify it. I'm one of those odd academics who is a pro-lifer, and I usually argue that most of these arguments for abortion are also defenses of infanticide. And then I would try to argue modus tollens, since infanticide was wrong, then abortion was, but that doesn't work as well anymore. More and more philosophers are defending infanticide. Tooley, McMahon, Giuliani, Minerva, Singer, and so many others. So I'm thinking that that may not be the most effective way to argue against abortion, via that the arguments for it entail infanticide. So I'll suggest a different attempt. Hopefully it will still be considered beyond the pale and repugnant, and that would involve sustained invisible loss of potential in those remaining alive but mindless. May provide more effective support for the pro-life position and the anti-infanticide position, then pointed out that McMahon-style abortion defenses entail infanticide. What I think of with abortion, sometimes, the early embryo does not look human. It's not. If it wasn't for a biology textbook, you may not recognize that it was a human. Infanticide is often done with the very ill or dying, and in either case, those once dead, they exit the scene. So I think it may be more effective if we imagine keeping the mindless embryo alive, but mindless, let it develop into a neonate, toddler, adult, and then we use it as a source of organs. We use it to test pharmaceuticals. You can add whatever you want. And I think there where the organism is present and you can see it's not how it ought to be, you may be more sympathetic to the sense that it's deprived, that you can harm the mindless when they don't develop the way they ought to be. So 7, just sort of a summary maybe of what I said, making humans into mindless present organ resources, unlike the aborted or those who died from infanticide, make them present organ resources or lab rats. Maybe that will elicit the appreciation of deprivation, how they ought to be, more than the absence of undeveloped embryos aborted and sickly newborns killed. So that's, if infanticide leaves you unmoved, I've argued elsewhere, the arguments usually for abortion, I think they all would give you infanticide. Maybe these will be more compelling to convince people that the mindless can be harmed even when they're mindless. All right, so what I'm going to do is modify McMahon's time relative interest account. I do agree with him that all the deaths aren't equally harmful. I'm more of an egalitarian, so I will not have the wrongness of death track harm. But I just want to emphasize and make the case that the very young, mindless, minimally minded, they can be greatly harmed. even if they're not going to be as harmed by their deaths as you and I. But they're going to suffer much greater deprivation than McMahon, whose time relative interest account just emphasizes psychological interest. The mindless don't have any interest that get put into his formula. All right. So my fundamental assumption when I do philosophy of medicine is that organisms, other than those that reproduce by fissioning out of existence, they're going to die from pathologies. All right. And so I'm assuming pathologies in a naturalist way is just dysfunction. It's going to be a failure to contribute to the goals of survival and reproduction. If you want to talk about why those are the goals, I've thought about and written about that recently in response to Kingma's sort of normative conventionalism about why the goals are survival and reproduction. All right, so that's my background assumption. It'll play a role in both my account of disease and my naturalism and my account of moral status. But let me say a little bit my naturalism, which might strike you as odd because I'm going to make a big deal morally about healthy development of fetus, this teleological account to health. I'm going to say it gives great moral status to human infants and embryos. Nonetheless, I have a value-free notion of disease. So why am I a naturalist about disease? One, I don't think health is essentially beneficial or to be valued or good for you, nor do diseases have to be necessarily harmful, disvalued. Two reasons are just sort of epistemic possibilities, you could say. Religious universalism, that's everyone goes to heaven, no matter how heinous they were. Or Epicureanism, which is the idea that death can be neither harm or benefit. You don't exist, you have to exist to be harmed or benefit. So I think just the possibility of those will suggest that will tease out our concept of disease as being value-free. Because remember, my fundamental assumption is organisms are going to die from diseases. I'm using disease, disorder, pathology as interchangeable. And so I don't want anyone dying without being pathological right before it, at least the moment before it. And so if you went to heaven, then disease wouldn't be harmful. But I still want to say that cause of death was a disease, a pathology, even if it was good for you. Likewise, if Epicureanism is true, and these I take it are epistemic possibilities, death could not be harmful for you, right? And we can imagine it won't even be pro tanto harmful. You were already, let's say, in a coma or something. And so there won't even be a pro tanto drop in harm, even if it's, all things considered, not a harm or benefit. And so just the possibility of Epicureanism, then death wouldn't be bad for you. The cause of death would be a pathology. It wouldn't be bad for you. So I mainly base my naturalism about disease and health on examples like that. But I'll give you a couple other examples. I'm not as confident in them. And that's number 20. There could be essential diseases. I'm a little suspicious of this, but this is the idea you couldn't exist without being diseased. So it was just so deep, the congenital disease was so deeply intertwined in your genome, you couldn't exist without it. And so we couldn't say disease is a harm for you, a congenital disease that's essential to you, because the alternative would be not having that disease would be not existing. And if we can't compare non-existing and existing, we can't say existing in that disease state is a harm. And then overdetermined diseases, it may be that some diseases come in pairs. And if you know the harm literature, cases of overdetermination or preemption, it's not easy to say why they're a harm, because if one hadn't occurred, the other would have. And so in the absence of that one event, there would be another event producing the same effect. And so maybe you can try to say there's still a harm here when you have overdetermination by saying it's a plural harm, a total harm of the two things. But that won't help make diseases harm, because the plural harm will not be a disease. The plural harm will be made up of two diseases. My colleague in the Romanell Center, Neil Feit, has pushed that line. Now, I'm a little suspicious of essential diseases. for the following sort of armchair biology, not that well informed, but I just assume a newborn zygote or embryo will not have expressed those congenital diseases, say like Down syndrome or something. And so those diseases are not yet expressed. The genes have not been expressed. I don't see, my intuition is you could remove them, possibly, it's metaphysically possible, without killing the organism. That is, if they're not expressed, the organism's alive, then preventing those genes from ever being expressed will not be fatal to that organism. Now, this will get complicated if these genes have more than one function in combination. But anyway, that's just some reason why I'm a little suspicious of essential diseases. So to sum up, I'm a naturalist about health and disease. Disease will usually be bad for you. I define disease as something like a suboptimal contribution of survival and reproduction. And so obviously dying sooner than later will make it very likely it'll be a harm, but it need not be. All right, so now let me try to say something about the health and well-being of the mindless. So I want to appeal to healthy development to come up with a theory of well-being of the mindless and why they can be greatly harmed, even though disease and health by themselves are not necessarily harmful or beneficial, respectively harmful, beneficial. All right, so 21. Health is constitutive of well-being in the mindless. That's all there is to the health of the mindless. To the well-being of the mindless is health, and that's all there is to harm in the mindless, disease. So health isn't defined normatively, but on my account, it makes possible considerable well-being. It's constitutive of considerable well-being, especially in a human being. So you just consider the human being's mind. It's just unrivaled cognitive and affective capabilities. So a healthy human mind will be rational, self-conscious. The person will be able to restrain themselves, to be prudent. They'll have all these various forms of affections, attachments, love. They'll be able to empathize. So a healthy human mind can do amazing things. It's unrivaled. And I'm going to, pretty like many people, I'm going to think our great value has something to do with the type of minds that we have. All right. 22, mindless and minded health. All there is, I said, to well-being in the mindless is health. That doesn't mean they're the same thing, but that's going to be constitutive. Once you're minded, health is not going to be all there is to your well-being. You can, two people can be equally healthy, but obviously have very different levels of well-being. But I still think health, although it can be overridden in the minded by other interests, maybe it's in your interest to die if your dignity and freedom is at stake. Maybe it's in your interest to get sick. You might meet the love of your life, the nurse or doctor. Maybe flat feet get you out of a war. Cowpox, so as you know, these stories is beneficial during a smallpox epidemic. There's the saying that pneumonia is the old man's friends. They have all these other infirmities. So I'm not ruling out that sometimes it's beneficial to be ill. But if being ill will do you any good, you're probably going to need to have considerable mental health. So got you out of the war, you met your true love in the hospital, but you have to be mentally healthy to benefit from that. And then with those creatures, non-human creatures that perhaps die when they reproduce or become the first meal of their offspring, I still would probably say that was good for them, and it would be a little anthropomorphic of us to deny it. But that's controversial. Okay. So let me try to develop a structural analogy. Maybe I put too much emphasis on this, between health and well-being. As you probably know, many philosophers are going to restrict well-being to the minded. The mindless can't have well-being. They'll say it's something metaphorical. But I'll start with just the structural analogies, and then I'll move on to the cost of denying the mindless well-being. So I'm taken with the structural analogies of health and well-being. We describe the healthy organisms as thriving, flourishing, doing better when their health improves, which is just similar to the way we talk about well-being. We talk about well-being in terms of flourishing, rising, thriving, and so forth. And then there's the structural analog here in 24 with pathology and ill-being. the pathological are failing, they're doing poorly, they're becoming worse when they're diseased. And we use that same language when we're talking about well-being. In fact, we call the opposite of well-being ill-being, which suggests a connection between disease and harm. So maybe I'm making too much of these analogies, but I'm trying to say, look at the way we talk about mindless plants as thriving, flourishing. I don't think we should say it's metaphorical. I don't think their health just of an embryo just becomes beneficial to it when it's conscious and can appreciate it or make possible other things. I think we should take this talk literally and say the mindless are thriving when they're healthy and they're harmed and doing poorly when they're diseased. All right, let me try to take a different tact and just say if you deny well-being to the mindless, you insist only conscious beings. Well-being involves, pleasure or interest, desire, satisfaction, something like that. You can't account for what I think are rather intuitive reactions to the following scenarios. So you can't account for the benefit of becoming conscious, say when the fetus becomes conscious for the first time. You can't account for the harm of remaining mindless. Remember my thought experiment where we just keep these embryos mindless and grow them into adults and use them as organ supplies, test drugs, who knows what else. Nor can you say when it is a harm to lose your mind permanently, or even temporarily when it's a benefit, say when a baby goes from crying and uncomfortable and sick to asleep. So why can't you say these things, which I think we want to be able to say? Well, remember, on a counterfactual comparative account of harm, we have to compare the well-being of the actual state to the well-being of the nearby world. So we can't say it's a benefit for a creature to become conscious in the first place, because we would have to compare the well-being of being mindless with the well-being of being conscious. And if you deny that the mindless have well-being, you can't say it was a benefit for any human being first to become minded. Okay? And you can't say it would be a harm if we kept that human being mindless forever, or as long as its life would live. You can't say that's a harm because we would have to compare the way it would be if it had developed in a healthy manner and would have the normal life to the way it was in a mindless state, because the mindless don't have well-being, per hypothesis. And then most of us think it's very bad for someone who's had a long conscious life to collapse into permanent unconsciousness. And we think it's bad when they're unconscious. And you can't say that it's bad to enter in a persistent vegetative state, or you can't say when it's bad, because that would involve comparing the well-being of being in a persistent vegetative state with the well-being of being conscious. At best, you can say it's a timeless harm. You can say the life in which you didn't collapse into persistent vegetative state is a better life than the life in which you were conscious for a while and then did enter into persistent vegetative state. We can compare those two lives, say one has more well-being than the other, but that gives us a timeless account of well-being. It doesn't say it's bad for you when you're unconscious to be unconscious. All right, so hopefully some of that will resonate. I know it's hard to convince philosophers the mindless have well-being, but I think they do. And let me perhaps help out by mentioning two types of interest. We often say broccoli is in the child's interest. It's good for her, even though she's not interested in it. She doesn't desire it. So there's a sense of an interest where something's good for you. And I'm going to claim health is good for you, necessarily good for you, or pro tanto good for you. Not all things considered good for you. And the mindless, of course, only have the former interest. They don't have desires. They're not interested in things, but things are good for them. And we often say of a conscious newborn, this is a standard move against, say, desire accounts or self-conscious defenses of abortion. We say there could be things that would be harm for the newborn or good for the newborn that they're unaware of. So it would be good for the newborn to have some surgery that it's unaware of, doesn't have the concepts for, doesn't desire. That would prevent a painless future death. And if you agree it has that interest in that treatment and that survival, but it's conscious, but it's completely unconscious of that interest, it looks like consciousness is doing no work. If the mindless if the minimally minded have interests they're unaware of, I don't see why those interests didn't exist earlier when they were mindless. Because consciousness is doing no work here. If you think a newborn has some interest in some surgery that will enable her to reproduce or enable her to live longer or enable her to develop in some way that she's not at all interested or conscious of, consciousness is doing the work. It's a wheel turns, it doesn't move anything. All right, so let me now move on to organism interests more specifically. I hope this isn't a reduction of my view that even plants have interest in the sense something's good for them. In water, sunlight, mineral-rich soil, etc. They thrive, flourish, things go well for them. They have well-being when they have them. So I'm going to argue that mindless human beings have interest in their health. Unlike the well-being of the grass isn't that great value, isn't very valuable. So it's good for the grass to have water, sunlight, mineral soil, but it's not a great harm. I don't think a plausible theory of well-being will make this into a great harm. But I think a human being, when when they're harmed, even when they're mindless, these will be great harms. All right, so let me move on a little bit. All right, what is health? Here's an account from Boris, close enough to serve my purposes. Health is the readiness of every part to perform its species' typical contributions, relativized to age and sex. Or, little boys are not unhealthy when they can't get pregnant. Little girls, too. So age and sex is important in your reference class. On species' typical occasions to survival and reproduction. Pathology is dysfunction. You could construe this like Boris, who does it statistically, or Wakefield in terms of selection. My own preference is a different type of etiological count. But it's not important for the vast amount of cases. Boris and Wakefield and I would just agree that this embryo is pathological. My own view is that we need a non-species conception of health, because remember, my fundamental assumption is organisms die by being pathological. If you need a historical, say, etiological count, or you need there to be species, you're going to have organisms dying without being unhealthy. The first organisms that ever existed would die without being unhealthy. Organisms that didn't have ancestors, that just came into existence from non-organic life, they will not be healthy because there isn't a earlier generation that can provide the norm. So, or they don't belong to a species. There are hybrids that may not belong to a species. One hybrid doesn't make a species. There are infertile hybrids, mules. There could be speciation could be going on, and it could be indeterminate, or maybe an early first generation of a species that fissioned off. Its organs are fine by the previous species, but it will soon be a suboptimal contribution because the species much later will have organs that work at a much more efficient rate. And you could get sort of weird retroactive or Cambridge changes, making this earlier first member of the species unhealthy because of what their conspecifics did later. There's interesting things with bacteria that are, if they share genes, they cause all sorts of problems, taxonomy. So I don't know if it'll come up. I just throw it out here that I think we want a fuller notion of health. I call it generic health, that isn't tied to species. Nonetheless, it'll have to be intertwined and compatible with species accounts. But this isn't probably that important for what I want to do, since we're talking about unproblematic members of species, human fetuses, and embryos. All right. Well-being and harm. Organisms are self-maintaining, goal-directed entities. They make adjustments in the pursuit of those goals, the survival and reproduction. How well they do that affects their health and well-being. So I don't think it's enough, like an artifact may have a goal, some missile, and it'll make adjustments. I don't want to say it has well-being because it's not maintaining itself. It's not metabolizing. It's not growing to replace and preserving itself. But an organism, I do think, has well-being. And in the mindless and minimally minded, it's mostly going to be in terms of health. and disease. All right. 30, the human organism is from the earliest moment making biological preparations for the development of its mind. So if certain things don't happen in the zygote, early embryo, it will never be minded. And I think it's because we have the minds that we do that we can be greatly harmed and prevent it from manifesting those minds. So I think you can harm an early embryo if you do something to it, make it pathological where it doesn't develop a healthy brain. So unlike some accounts of potentiality where people go, look, the potential for being president, potential president doesn't have the rights of a president. What work is the potential doing? I'm not just thinking of something in the future, like this person will be a president in the future, and you may then wonder why they should have any special status now. But I'm thinking right now, that embryo at each moment, it has an interest in healthy development. It's preparing for the growth of its brain. Right now, it has an interest right now as an embryo in this brain and its capacities, which will enable it. Just the mere exercise of that capacity to enable it to have great well-being. And if that interest in healthy development is frustrated, it will be a great harm. All right. Developing interest. Okay. Fetal humans will later acquire contingent interest. So the fetus doesn't have an interest in football, American football, or European football. If you move that child, raise them in Europe, and they never develop the interest in American football, I don't think that's a harm, or vice versa. If you move to the kid is raised in America rather than Europe and never develops an interest in European football, soccer, we call it, that's not a harm. So there are going to be contingent interests that just come about because of where you are, who you meet, and so forth. Right? And these will be developed, but I think every organism necessarily has an interest in health. It's a pro-tanto interest. It can be overridden when you're minded, but I think they always have it, always will. I think that's why it would be good for a mindless human being after it lapses in a coma to be cured, even if it has no psychological interest in being cured, even if its brain's been devastated. Now, my view is the more ties to the future, the greater the loss. So I share this with the time relative interest. The more you're tied to the future, the greater the loss, the more you're deprived of something that you've taken ownership of, that are involved in. So I think there's healthy interests, which are necessarily always there, to develop a mind, to reason, to form attachments, be prudent. These are things all mentally healthy people can do. And then there'll be contingent interests that will rise later. So let me use this idea of healthy determinables and determinants. So I think there's an interest in health, even in the mindless embryo. Let's say a healthy human being will maybe form attachments, fall in love. And that interest, and that healthy interest will get filled out. It'll be made more determinate. So imagine someone who has never searching and fall in love. They're sort of like a psychopath, no interest. I'm told psychopaths have in love. I think that person's life is not as bad, or that aspect of their life is not as harmful as searching for love and failing to find love. So you want to find love, but you never meet anyone, which is, I think, more harmful for you than not searching and failing. But it's even worse. What's even worse is unrequited love for Chris. So now you have that interest in love has been filled out. You want to do certain things with Chris, and it becomes much more specific. And so that frustration of that interest, an interest you've always had in affection or love, becomes much worse as it gets filled out. So this is what I share with the time relative interest account. The big difference is I think the mindless have interest and they get filled out later, so that the frustration of those interests will be worse, but there are already great harms in the mindless. You don't need a mind to be greatly harmed. Okay. Adding the interest of the mindless to the time relative interest account. So McMahon here in 32, he restricted interest to the consciousness. I'm expanding the time relative interest to the mindless. I'm saying there are certain things in your interest, particularly, the affective and cognitive capacities of human beings, which will make abortion and infanticide into great harms. I mean, you can always argue they're not immoral because The woman has the right to do what she wants with her body, like Judith Thompson. That's a whole nother story. So I'll just say here that considerable pro tanto harms. And I don't even think they're as bad as the death of the pregnant woman. So, because she has so many more interests that have been filled in, determinate is made determinate. So she'll lose more from her death. So if we had to choose between the life of a fetus threatening its mothers in terms of harm, if that was the only consideration, there's other considerations, intentionally killing the innocent and so forth. But if that was the only consideration, the woman would suffer much, much greater harm than the fetus, even though the fetus would lose more years. Fetus isn't as tied to that. But it's more tied to that future than McMahon does. 33, skip 33 because I skipped this Unger Williams line earlier. Let me just finish up with comparing my view now to Marquis. So I've compared it to McMahon. I accept this sort of bell curve about the harm of death. I just think the mindless can be greatly harmed, not just the minded, because they have interests in health, and health for a human is unrivaled by health of any other species that we know of. Now, Marquis thought the worst death is the earliest, and he also thought wrongness tracked harm. So the greatest harm, greatest wrong would be the earliest death. And he tries to explain away the time relative interest account, this rival account, and says the harm of fetal death is ignored as they're not in the social world, so we don't see fetuses, they're in the dark, not one of us interacting with much. And we don't appreciate their losses because their immaturity denies us the specifics of the deprivation. So we don't know if they'll like soccer, they'll fall in love with this person, another person, what their career will be, their goals. And so we don't appreciate, he says, their loss. I think there's something to this, but not as much as Marquis. So let me first give a reduction of Marquis's valuable future life account. It'll support my modified time relative interest account. So Marquis, if you don't know, he thinks what makes death wrong is the creatures lose out on a valuable future like ours. So he first just leaves abortion aside, says what's wrong with killing someone? Well, it's what they're deprived of, and then he points out fetuses are deprived of similar lives. But I think you can reduce this view to absurdity, even if this isn't biologically in the case. The mere possibility, for all we know, will reveal to us it isn't sufficient to be harmed that you're identical to something with a valuable future. That's necessary, but not sufficient. And Marquis just thinks it's sufficient. So just imagine we could take totipotent cells out of the first embryo. Maureen Condrick just spoke in Buffalo last weekend, very suspicious that they have this totipotency before they're removed, or even have it perhaps after the second cell stage. But imagine we did remove a cell. It was in an identity-preserving way, put it in another womb, and it grew into a being like us. It doesn't seem we would have harmed that cell by not doing it. If we had just left it a part of the embryo where it just contributed to the embryo and didn't itself become an embryo and then a person. Same with if we could take differentiated cells, like in cloning, and somehow restore their totipotency and they turn into human being 9 months, or will be born 9 months later. And this is, let's assume, is an identity-preserving intervention, which it probably isn't, but let's just assume. It isn't a harm to it if we don't do it. And there are other species that can produce parthenogenetically. The eggs can be fertilized or can just develop on their own. Let's imagine we can do this to human eggs and it's identity preserving, which probably it isn't, but if we could do it and it was identity preserving, we haven't harmed such eggs by not doing it. And then if you have a metaphysics of unrestricted composition, that is any two things compose a third, then the scattered gametes, the egg and sperm, will be an object that will then later, all goes well, fuse and develop into a being like us. It seems you've done no harm if you prevent those scattered gametes from. Why? Because none of these creatures are unhealthy when they don't develop. I think to think these things have great value and would be wrong if they were denied this is a reductio of Marquis's view. And I would explain why we don't feel they're harmed is because they don't have an interest. They are not unhealthy when they don't become human persons, right? 36, pro-lifers committed to protecting embryos will not feel any obligation to promote the valuable features of those other creatures that I just mentioned. But these are all entities not in the social world. What explains the different reaction? My contention, it's only that the embryo is unhealthy. So we have lots of creatures who are not in the social world, which was what Marquis thought was preventing us from appreciating their value. Pro-lifers, like myself, will only care for one of those, not the others. Even though none of them are in the social world, what's the explanation of the difference? It's because only the human zygote and embryo is unhealthy. Right? The others are not unhealthy if they're not so developed. They just remain parts of a gametes or parts of an embryo. Right? Valuable futures that don't matter because they're not unhealthy. So we can extend this analysis to these famous reductios of potential, even intrinsic potential, like Thule's kittens, McMahon dogs, and robots that have not yet become conscious. Thule's reductio that potential matters is that there's a serum, you could inject it in a kitten, turns it into a person. He doesn't think it's wrong not to do it or even to stop it after it started. On my account, that kitten is not unhealthy if it doesn't develop into a person, so it doesn't have an interest in becoming a person. We've done nothing wrong, not tapping that metaphysical possibility. McMahon has this interesting story of dogs. He's trying to show he has a lot of hylomorphic people in mind who think there's a difference between active and passive potential. He says these dogs have the intrinsic potential to become human beings. If we interact with them, they'll learn language and they'll be as intelligent as us. If we interact with them just like we do our own children, which, if you raise children, it takes years to get them cognitively impressive in learning language. And we don't have to interact with these dogs, even though they have the intrinsic potential to become persons. My account is they're not unhealthy if we don't. They haven't evolved or they don't have the design to be persons, and we haven't done anything wrong or harmed them because they have no interest in being persons, even though they have the potential to be persons. And then robots too. Let's say there's a robot, it will become conscious later if you flick a switch or download something or do something to it. And this is identity preserving. The robot that was unconscious will be the same robot that's conscious in a sci-fi scenario, like with a mind like ours. You've done nothing wrong if you destroy it before it becomes conscious. Why? It's not unhealthy. It has no interest. The only mindless things with interest are organisms, and their only interest is health. And what's interesting here in 39 is we can imagine this robot has a determinate program. So we know exactly what it'll be like when it goes online or becomes conscious. So this takes us to Marquis's other objection to the time relative interest account, that we fail to appreciate the harm because it's indeterminate what it'll be like. We don't know what the future goals, projects, values, interests, desires of these embryos are. But now we know exactly what that robot will want. If you have my intuition, maybe my intuitions are just so corrupted by my theories and other projects. But my view is you haven't, even though you fully know what that robot, when it becomes conscious, would experience, you haven't wronged it by preventing it become conscious. So it's not the fact that we don't know what its future is, it's that it's not alive and only living things have interest and their only interest is in health. Conclusion, so here's what I've done. I try to do a path between Marquis and McMahon. On one hand, McMahon's time relative interest account, number 41, tells harms could not befall human beings before they become conscious, nor could those with mineral minds suffer considerable harms. The other extreme considers the greatest harms to those who befall the youngest human beings. This is Marquis and people who share his view, regardless of their mental capacity and ties to the future at the time of their premature death. I hope to have preserved the truth of the time relative interest, that all harms of all deaths are unequal, and it does depend on how tied you are to the future. But I've done this by modifying the time relative interest account to include interests that the mindless and minimally minded have in their healthy development, recognizing that the mindless and minimally minded can have interests that they are not consciously interested in, that they don't desire to fulfill, can theoretically account for our intuitions that premature deaths and congenital mental impairments are great harms. Thank you.